Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. It is about 9 o'clock here in Singapore, and you have joined the second session of AmCham Singapore's America Through the Eyes of. And today we are going to be seeing America through the eyes of Professor Hahrie from Johns Hopkins University. And I want to thank you for joining. My name is Hsien-Hsien Lei. I'm the CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce in Singapore. And we started this series because everybody loves feedback, right? And the point is that America needs feedback. And we Americans, and that includes Hahrie and me, we need feedback. And it's time for us to listen and learn, because as a country, as a citizen of the world, it is important for us to figure out how we can do things better and how we can live and coexist happily and productively together. And that is the reason why I've invited Professor Hahrie to join us today. And you will see that her area of research and the insights that she brings is so incredibly relevant. But first, I would like to give a shout out to my former boss, Bob White, who has just retired from Medtronic. He is one of my favorite bosses ever, and he was the one who really taught me how to listen and learn. So this session is dedicated to Bob and his amazing leadership over the decades. And so I do wish that any of you who know him do congratulate him on his recent retirement. So moving on to Professor Hahrie, as I mentioned, she's a professor at Johns Hopkins University. She is the inaugural director of the SNF Agora Institute, which focuses on understanding civic engagement and many other aspects of political science. I will not be able to explain it as well as she will. So I'm going to leave it to her to explain to you her research. But before I invite Professor Han to share with you her initial thoughts about America, I wanted to share a paragraph that I read in her book, which is called Prisms of the People. And I read this while my daughter was playing volleyball this weekend. Can you believe this?
Oh my God.
And and I thought to myself, I got to read this book before I have the chance to talk to you. But as I started reading it, I found myself not really paying attention to the game. So
Oh
yes,
no.
that's how much of a nerd I am, but also just the way you tell the story of how all these different organizations strategize and organize themselves was just completely captivating. And it inspired me and motivated me so much that anyway, the game is recorded. I can watch it anytime. And anyway, her team won. So what does she need me for, right? So I spent most of the 4 hours during the tournament reading your book. And in the first chapter, if I'm not mistaken, you wrote something that I just thought was quite comical, but then the rest of the book, you went about explaining why it doesn't have to be like this. And this paragraph reads, copious, well-executed, and important research has taught us that humans are racist, petty, short-sighted,
Oh my God.
self-segregating beings who are impervious to change and more likely to build institutions that instantiate the privilege of certain groups instead of equalizing it. It's so disturbing. But the rest of your book goes about saying, no, it doesn't have to be like this. And so I want to invite you then, Prof, to tell us more about your research and why you think that there is a way to look at how we gather in groups and be effective together.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's so nice to have this conversation with you. So I'm really excited for the opportunity. So thanks for inviting me. And also, it's so nice of you to read the book. You definitely did not have to do that. So I could have summarized it for you. So thank you for doing that. So maybe I'll tell you a little bit about how I got into this work to sort of talk about like what the work is. Because I think it's sort of related for sure to the point that you just made. My parents are Korean. And they immigrated to the United States, and I was born in the United States, and I grew up mostly in Texas, which is the southern part of the U.S. And I think growing up in Texas as a daughter of Korean immigrants, like definitely shaped my worldview. Like my parents weren't really politically active. Politics wasn't something we talked about at the dinner table. They were just trying to like figure out how to live in America, and like how to make it, and things like that. And and even though we never even talked about politics, I think one of the lessons that I did learn is this idea that like transformation is not only possible, but it's a part of what we do as humans, right? That my parents were trying to, move themselves like halfway around the world and then remake themselves so that they could remake a life for their family, to that would then kind of have implications for the way in which they operated and lived in the world. And so I sort of took for granted, even though no one ever said the words to me, that there's this that humans have this transformative capacity to change themselves. And I think that was always a part of what I had in my background. And so I never was interested in civic engagement or community life or anything like that. But then when I went to college, I got involved in some different student organizations as you often do when you're in college. And through those student organizations, I began to get involved in more and more kind of community activity and public engagement. And I think for the first time, I began to sort of realize that this transformative ability for people to come together and put their hands in the levers of change and kind of change their remake their communities in the ways they want. It happens not only kind of in our families, but in the ways in which we relate to each other in the public sphere. And so that's what got me really interested, I think, in thinking about politics and civic engagement and democracy and other questions like that. Because, if you read some of the, kind of work on politics and civic engagement, like the kind of promise that exists at the heart of any civic endeavor is the idea that by having people work with each other, they begin to transform their self-interest into common interest. They begin to learn how to develop the skills that they need to work with other people and to create a better world for everybody. And all of that kind of stuff was really intoxicating for me. And so it got me really interested in working on those issues. And so I ended up working in politics for a few years and working on some political campaigns and different things like that. But then eventually when I got burned out from working there, I decided to go to grad school. And I always thought that I would go to grad school and then, go back and work in politics or something like that. But it turned out I really loved the research and I loved the teaching. I love the ability to work with students. And so a lot of the work that I've ended up doing has been about trying to understand, how do you pull people off the sidelines into public life? And then how do you create the kind of scaffolding around them to enable people to become architects of their own future? And I think that was what was really powerful for me, was kind of feeling like when I went to college and I learned how I could become an author of my own future, as opposed to just accepting the choices that other people gave me. That was what was really intoxicating. And so a lot of what we try to do is try to understand, what are the kind of, what's the kind of support and education and structures that people need to be able to do that? And then how do you harness the power of people working together to be able to create a better world? And so at the SNF Agora Institute, a lot of what we do is kind of think about how that works in the context of democracy and other kinds of political systems. But we're, definitely really interested in that core question of how it is that people and communities can become architects of the futures that they want to design.
So how does, I got a bunch of questions, but
Yeah.
first, I love that you discovered yourself in college because it's such a difficult time of life. I think people always romanticize what college is about. They're like, oh, you can do whatever you want. I'm like, not really. You actually don't have any clue what you want. So it becomes very stressful. So I love this idea that there was a period of time where you could discover that. But along with that, I think when people are discovering what drives them and what they're interested in, there's also a certain amount of fear. And that fear that comes along with engaging as an individual rather than hiding behind an org. I mean, I don't say hiding in a negative way, but to be protected by an organization, to be part of something larger, that is quite nice. But as individuals, when we want to, just stop and do something that's helpful, to participate as an individual, it's really scary. So how did you overcome that? Was it because, you were part of the educational elite that you felt like nobody's going to touch me? How does the ordinary person overcome this fear of getting involved?
Yeah, no, that fear is really real, because, and it's not, sometimes we think about the fear in the context of, people who have less privilege maybe have more trouble kind of getting involved because there's sort of ways in which it can seem threatening to things that they hold dear. But even for people who, have a lot of, have a lot of resources and things like that, I think it's fearful to engage and have to state your opinions in public. And what if people disagree with you? Or it's scary to have to ask even a friend to say, hey, do you want to come to this meeting with me? And what if they reject you? All of those things are kind of, there's different ways in which we have interpersonal fear and we have social fear and fear of speaking up and speaking our opinions. I think the thing that I found, and that is, and then it's kind of true in the research too, is that it's really important to find kind of communities of belonging, and places where you have this feeling of people accepting you as a whole person, and so if I walk into a community and I feel like I'm accepted not just for like one opinion that I give, but for the whole person that I am, then I feel like I can test out and try different things and sort of say things that maybe I'm not really sure if this is what I really think, or is this an opinion that I really have, and then kind of see how people react and then learn from the reactions that people have and react in real time. But it requires a certain kind of comfort that is really necessary for people to be able to do that kind of work. And that's what the research shows actually, is that a lot of times we have this thought that in the public sphere that kind of like belief precedes belonging. But actually what the research shows is that belonging comes before belief. That like what people tend to believe flows from and is influenced by the communities and places where they feel belonging, as opposed to people choosing those communities based on what they believe. Like we find that the research shows that really that sense of belonging and that interpersonal connection matters more. And so, the thing that I always tell people is like, for me, it was really important to have people reach out and kind of invite me into spaces and make me feel comfortable and make me feel like I wanted to be there. And whenever I tell people who are trying to get other people involved, like that's one of the first important things to do, is instead of hitting them over the head with, something that you're trying to get them to do, like instead just try to get to know them as a person. And when you do that, it creates a whole different context within which people can act.
That brings a smile to my face, because I do think that if it feels good to know that you belong. But on the other hand, again, in my twisted little brain, I'm thinking about the United States. And
Yeah,
I'm thinking, heck, I mean, it in some ways, it's almost like you could indoctrinate someone by just being nice to them. They don't even have to agree with you to start with. You just go,
right.
hey, I got pizza and I got ice cream. Why don't you come with me and hang out? And then for the first couple of times, you're just hanging out. And the next thing you know, you insidiously plant seeds in their head about things. And then now
Right.
you got social media too, right? So
Yeah.
couldn't it just go haywire? This whole belonging supersedes belief.
Yes, it can totally go haywire because, to your point, it's like it can be completely manipulative, right? If people are like, "Hey, I just want to become your friend and like let's have coffee and like let's hang out," but really I'm trying to like indoctrinate you into my little cult or something like that, right? And so it can totally go haywire. And so there is like an ethical dimension to all this, right? And the thing that I always like tell students or tell people who are working on this is that like to me the difference between me trying to manipulate you and me not manipulating you is the extent to which I am transparent about what I'm trying to do, right? So if I sort of say, "Hey, Shen, you want to have coffee?" and you're like, "No." And I'm like, "Come on, like let's have coffee," right? And it's like super awkward, right? Because it feels like I'm just trying to become your friend, right? And that's a very different interaction than if I say, "Hey, I'm with the SNF Agora Institute, and I really am trying to get other people involved in our work. And I know that you don't really know us that well, but I wonder if you'd be willing to sit down and have coffee with me to see if we can get to know each other and if there are any ways that some of the stuff that we're doing might overlap with the things that you're interested in. And so then it's a different kind of proposition because you have the freedom and the choice to be able to say, "You know what, I actually don't want to talk to you because I don't want to find out more about what you do, right? Or I don't want to become your friend or something like that. And so I think it's really important from an ethical standpoint that when we're trying to engage people in public life, that we're always transparent about our goals. But we can say, "I'm trying to get you involved in the work of the SNF Agora Institute. But to do that, I want to sit down and just get to know you as a person. So can we have coffee together?" And that we can still have that social interaction without necessarily being manipulative. I think one of the things that we find that's challenging right now, not only in the US, but all over the world, is that a lot of those kinds of interactions are happening online where you don't have the same kind of
Mhm.
intentionality or ethical layer, sort of put over the interactions that people are having. And so there are a lot of questions I think that we as a society need to think about in terms of how it is that we, can ethically make sure that we're respecting people's autonomy as we bring them into the different kind of communities that we want to bring them into. But yeah, it's totally a good point, but there's a double-edged sword here for sure.
For sure. But it's there's always a pro and a con to everything. I just want to kind of go back in time for you, with you a little bit, because you mentioned that you did work in politics for a while. That got you to go to grad school and do some more research around it and decided not to return. So I just want to go back because I'm looking at your bio to my left screen here. And you did serve as, you were the co-convener of a policy advisory committee for the 2008 Obama campaign. And then you served as the chair of the advisory committee when on the transition team, right? The Obama-Biden transition team. If you think back to those years, and gosh, isn't it amazing? It's been 16 years.
I know.
How have things changed in America? Because you're now, and you're pretty close to Washington. You're in Baltimore after all.
Right.
How have things changed since 2008?
Oh my gosh.
I know, it's like, what hasn't changed?
I know,
Have you been paying attention?
I mean, it's so funny because it's like I think back to 2008 and I'm like, wow, I feel so naive, because it was just like, the world felt like such a different place at that time. I mean, there are a couple things that we know for sure, just looking at the data, which is that things like the level of polarization has gone up, so the extent to which people feel more like affectively distant from the people who are not like them that's increased. We've had situations like, January 6th, where we had, the riot at the United States Capitol. And I think things that people thought never could happen in the United States, like the sort of contestation of the peaceful transition of power after an election, that was the first time in American history that had happened. And so I think there's a way in which there's been a lot of things that have happened like that people thought, oh, that doesn't happen in America, but it does, And so I think when I think about the difference between 2008 and now, it's like what has been revealed is the sort of fragility of sort of different structures in our society, which to me means that like all of us have to do more work to kind of create the sort of resilience that we need in the societies that we want, right? So that we can't just depend on our political leaders. Like, they could be great or they could be not great, but like the people have to be able to engage with each other regardless of that to sort of, keep a hold on the kind of communities that we want. And so I think that's one of the things that has become really clear between in the past, I don't know how many years that was, but, past 10 or 15 years of history.
Yeah, I remember, some people will say, hey, look, each presidential term is only 4 years. Certain elected offices are only 2 years, and then they're up for election again. It's not, these people come in and come and go. But we as voters, the folks who work in government as civil servants, they are the steady stabilizing force. But it's hard to kind of think about that because the leaders who are elected make so much noise, they suck up all the oxygen, and it makes the rest of us feel like, well, where's my voice? So on that front, how do we as individuals feel like we have a voice when online, in the media, it's all these people, and some of them are actual leaders and others just self-proclaim their leadership. How do we actually counter folks who are just making so much noise?
I know. It's so hard right now because, we live in like an attention economy, where it's like people that say the most outrageous things are the ones that kind of like suck up all the attention. And it's infuriating in a lot of ways. So so that's one of the questions that we kind of think about a lot in the work that we do. And there's a couple things I would say is one of the things is that we know, like we know that like the kind of voices that are prioritized through a lot of the online algorithms that we have are in fact the most extreme voices, right? And so we always encourage people to try to think about what are the ways in which you're interacting with people that aren't beholden to algorithms that someone else is creating, right? Because like before we had social media, like we all kind of had our own little algorithms in our head about like, who are the people I want to sit with at the lunch table in high school, right? Like, who are the people that I want to go have drinks with after dinner? Like, who are the people I want to, and these are all kind of like little algorithms that we're making in our head about like, oh, this group is a group that I want to hang out with. And this is where I want to get more information. This is what I want to learn more about. And what we've done is we've essentially kind of like outsourced it to these like tech companies and sort of said, hey, like, I don't need to do it myself. Like, I'm going to let Elon Musk decide like what my algorithm is going to look like, And so I think part of what we sort of find is that like people feel better when they feel like they have more autonomy, over the quote unquote kind of algorithms that choose like who they're hanging out with, who are they spending time with, who are they getting news from, all of that kind of thing. So we always try to encourage people to try to like find spaces where you can shape those choices yourself. So that if you want to be with people who are just like you, that's great. If you want be with people who are totally different from you, that's also great. If you want to, at different moments in time, we all might want different things. And so we shouldn't just restrict ourselves to one place. And so having that kind of like heterogeneity or having lots of different places where you go to get that kind of information is really important. And then there's also obviously like a lot of like structural things that we can do. Like there are a lot of people who are working right now to try to figure out like how can we think about creating social media that actually helps society as opposed to hurting society, or how do we, different things like this. So there are a lot of kind of things that we can do, but I think as everyday people, we have more ability than people sometimes recognize to be able to make choices that allow us to kind of reclaim our own autonomy in shaping the kind of information environment that we have around us. The one other thing that I'll say is that I think one of the things that's so interesting about this moment that we live in is that, what if you look at the data, one of the most common ways in which people engage with their communities or engage with public life is by reading the news. And what reading the news is really, it's about reading about decisions that other people made, And so so if that's the only way that you're engaging with your community is by just like reading about decisions that other people make, then you never kind of like develop the sense that like, hey, like I'm someone who can make decisions too. Like I live in this community too, and I can also make choices about it, And so I think it's really important for people to also try to find ways where they're not just consuming other people's decisions, but putting themselves in settings where they can become decision makers, right? Where they can kind of figure out, hey, like my neighbors and I, like, we don't like the way our trash is getting picked up, or, we want to like, clean up the garden in our community, or we want to fix up the park, or whatever the different things are. These are all kind of like things that people can do that give people practice in being able to develop those kind of habits and skills and so on.
Oh, that's so interesting. I've never thought about the news as being a way just to see what other people are deciding to do, possibly on my behalf, and that I couldn't do certain things on my own. I just never thought about reading the news in that way, but you're right, it's very passive. So,
Right. I mean,
do you think
people get outraged, so it doesn't feel passive sometimes, But it is sort of, it's kind of like outsourcing decision making, right? It's like someone else can make all the decisions that are necessary.
Yeah, I never get outraged. Let's just put that out there. But I guess sometimes, like you said, like you're reading the news and you can leave a comment, so you feel like you've done something because you've aired your view, you've left a comment. But what does that actually do? You've just gotten outraged and left a comment. So it's not actually all that productive.
Right.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about the work that you're doing internationally, because clearly many of us are sitting outside of the US who are joining this call, this session, but there are people who are joining from inside the United States, which is pretty cool because we had folks joining from the Midwest and all that last time. But let's go internationally for a little while, because I do think America has a very unique position in the world, and people look to the US to see what we're up to. And so when you come out, last time I met you in person was in Singapore, and I know that you're supporting some of the government work here in Singapore. What do you think when you come out here? Are you surprised by how the United States is perceived? Are you sort of like, oh, I feel so happy to be American? What's your take on America when you are not in America?
I think that that's a really good question. I think that I don't know that I would say that I'm proud. I think that whenever I'm not in America, I realize how America-centric too many Americans are. Like when you go out into the world, it's like there's this amazing, rich, vibrant global community, right, of people all over, no matter where you go. And there's so much to learn from anywhere that you are. And I think America has such a strong sense, Americans can have such a strong sense of their own hegemony sometimes that it can feel a little bit insular, so that whenever you go outside the country, it's like, oh my God, there's like this, these like rich, really exciting questions and ideas and things to explore that Americans don't pay as much attention to sometimes. And so I always get reminded of that when I go abroad. But then also it's also it is interesting to me that, as an English speaker and as an American, you can go so many places in the world, right? And you sort of see the way in which things are so interconnected now. So on the other hand, I'm like struck by the way in which things feel really interconnected, but then also that like America can sometimes feel a little bit too maybe closed off sometimes from everything else, all the opportunities that are out there. I mean, how does it seem for you as like an kind of an expat? I don't know if that's the right term, like as someone who grew up in America and then, now lives elsewhere, like how does it feel to you?
Yeah, I just think it's funny 'cause I have been sharing this story lately because it didn't happen so long ago where, okay, so I tend to be the loud American thinking we're so cool. And I fully admit and am self-aware that I can be rather obnoxious. Now, whether that's related to me being an American or not, I can't be completely sure. But but some months ago, not too long ago, somebody said to me, Shen, when I first met you, I could not really accept you. And I thought, huh? And it was rather, shocking to me, but it was such an important reminder that where we go in the world, cultures are incredibly different. And
Yeah.
how Americans think that you have to be outspoken and you have to stand up for yourself and you need to essentially act like an extrovert even when you're not. You have to have really high energy. All of these things that what we think packages up somebody who's successful is not necessarily required or even liked in other
Yeah.
parts of the world. So I do think the Americanness of things, perhaps maybe it's also changed over time as we become more aware of other cultures, that we realize that one way the American dominance is, despite Hollywood and whatnot, is just not the only way to go to be successful.
Yeah. No, that's like a great point. Yeah, is that I remember when I was younger, I mostly grew up in the United States, but I spent 1 year living in Japan, and and people would always come up to me and they'd be like, "Oh, are you American?" And I'm like, "I didn't even open my mouth. Like, how do you know that I'm American just by like looking at me?" And I remember someone said it's because like we can tell by the way that you make eye contact. That like just like
Oh,
when I'm like walking down the street, like I just have, there's like a, like a way of making eye contact that was just very Western, that people could pick up on. And so you sort of realize like there are all these kind of like tiny little mannerisms that we all have that communicate culture
true.
in a way that that you don't think about even. So
So in your position now, you're doing research. Would you mostly research? How much of it do you think is applicable? What of your research right now is applicable to what we do on an everyday, that if you had a few takeaways for us as individuals, and many of our listeners, our joiners are from corporations because we are the Chamber of Commerce, we represent companies. Would you tell individuals or companies, how do we go about being engaged and so that we can be productive and successful as individuals and as organizations? And a lot of it could be informed by the research that you're doing now.
yeah, that's a great question. So for, so what are some of the takeaways? So first of all, I think that I think that, business has like a huge role to play, in shaping community life all the time. And so, to me, in my mind, like corporations are not just creators of product, which of course they are, like that is a big part of what they do, but it's all they're also pillars of a community, no matter where the community is, and as employers, they create communities in the workplace and everything like that. So, I always feel like I would love for business to kind of think about, what are the ways in which they cultivate communities within the workplace, even within their own offices, in ways that encourage people to kind of think about their role as residents in that community. So they're not just employees, but they're actually kind of like residents in that community. There's some really interesting research by some psychologists from Princeton where they had some companies in China experiment with different kinds of ways of doing meetings. And if they had meetings where the supervisor would come and tell everyone what to do, then everyone would just go and do it. Whereas if they had meetings where the supervisor would step aside and let the workers kind of think about like, what are the problems that we have and how are we going to solve them? And they could brainstorm solutions. And then they still had to work with their supervisor to like figure out what they're going to do and stuff like that. But the idea that they could sort of identify problems and brainstorm solutions themselves kind of had all these downstream effects where they had greater employee retention, greater higher satisfaction, like all of that kind of stuff. But then they also saw that their employees were more likely to get involved in their communities. So it's just sort of a way in which you kind of see like the way, we spend so much of our time in the workplace, that the workplace kind of shapes our sense of who we are and who we want to be in the world. And so companies, I think, have a big role to play in that. So that's sort of like one thing. Another thing I would say is that at the individual level, like no matter who you are, whether you're, you may not be a manager, if you're an employee or if you're the boss or like whatever you like, no matter who you are, one of the things that is pretty clear across the research is that like everyone has a role to play in kind of being able to realize their own ability to put their hands on the levers of change, and that's just something where those are not skills that people are born with. Like we're not born, this is the paragraph that you read at the beginning. Like we're not born with the skills of knowing how to work with each other, of knowing how to like pull people together, of how to solve problems, of how to like get things out there. And so people have to learn them, And so I think everyone has, I always want everyone to kind of go out and figure out like, what is this thing that I'm sort of that I care about in the world that I want to work on? And then how can I figure out how to get other people to work on it with me? And just being able to do that, even at a really small level. One of the things that we find is that it has huge downstream effects, again, for the ways in which it shapes people's like ongoing trajectories over time. So just starting is like really important. And then the last thing I'll just say is kind of what we talked about before, is that, the idea that belonging comes before belief, like is basically, relationships, like quality of the relationships that people construct with each other is like such a building block for so much of what we see as being good in terms of being able to create resilient communities, that like, we should all be kind of thinking about how we construct and maintain and sustain and constantly renew the sort of network of relationships that we're a part of.
I'm kind of surprised. So, I'm from public health, so a little bit more of the data, epidemiology. We don't look at emotions that much. And I wouldn't have thought that political science would be so heartwarming. But honestly, when I hear you speak, it makes me feel good, because it makes me think that it's not so hopeless, that we could all just do small things and that would have such, huge downstream effects, not just for us, but in our community, that everything we do is interconnected and can have such positive impact. I'm sorry, I kind of pigeonholed you, hey, Hahri's a political science professor. It's going to be really dry. But, the work that you're doing is just so invigorating and heartwarming. I just really want to thank you for doing that and bringing it out so that people outside of academia can understand and do better.
Well, that's such a nice thing for you to say. And so, I mean, I will say, I think, I'm kind of a hopeful person, and so I think, it's probably like that, it shapes that. But, I'll just sort of maybe say this, is that like, when I was, I didn't major in political science when I was an undergrad. I majored in like history and literature, because I loved reading books and I just wanted to like read novels all the time. And so that's what I did. But I remember I had to take one political science class. And I remember, in it, we had to read this, the Federalist Papers, which are these like, kind of some of the founding documents in the United States. And there's this quote from Madison that's pretty famous, where he writes about, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. What is government but the greatest of all reflections on mankind? And I remember reading that and I was like, that's what I want to do. If like politics is like a reflection of our humanity, like that's what I want to get involved in, and the kind of promise of politics that Madison is talking about is that the basic idea is that if people work together, then they can reach for their better angels, And I think that's what we often forget, because we get so caught up in all the kind of like negative aspects of politics, of which there are many, for sure. But the audacious promise at the heart of it, of public life, is that if people come together, if people work with each other, then they overcome all of those kind of self-interested kind of parochial instincts that you read the paragraph about at the beginning. And so I think I've always kind of held on to that hope that we can kind of use research as a way of trying to recover and find how those mechanisms work in such a way that make it possible for more people to access.
I know you have another book coming out in September that's a little bit more about what's happening in the US.
Yeah.
So I'll let people discover that, because to me, the topic is a bit controversial in a sense. But
Yeah.
I do think one of your future books could be about the promise of politics, because I get pretty tired of people telling me, oh, politics is so dirty. I don't want to have anything to do with it. Politicians are all awful. I'm like, hello, these people make the policies that you have to live with.
Yeah.
So as much as you don't like politics, politics is in your life. So
Right.
I think that you've got something there that people need to hear.
Yeah, I love
It's a
that.
little
There's
pitch for your next book.
Yeah, no, it's sort of like it's, I had a mentor once who used to always say, like, if you ignore politics, politics will come for you. So it's like it's
Ooh,
gonna be in your life no matter what. And so if you want to be able to shape what it's like get involved, And so, and if you can get involved in a hopeful way, then if I could write something that would make people feel more hopeful about that, I would totally do it.
yes, please do. So
All right.
right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap up the LinkedIn Live portion of our conversation so we can move into more of the private conversation with those who registered via Zoom. For those of you who joined us on LinkedIn, I do believe that the link to Zoom is available in the post somewhere. So if you want to join in the private conversation, go ahead and click on that register and we'll let you into the private conversation that's going to take place after I asked Professor Hsien-Hsien these 3 fast questions about her thoughts on America, and they're gonna be super hard, so get ready.
Okay, I'm ready.
Number 1, what's your favorite American food?
Pizza.
Oh, yeah, what flavor?
What's that? Supreme.
What?
I like the Supreme.
Oh
It's got
yeah,
like
me too,
everything on
totally.
it. Yeah,
Okay, but
totally.
what
I
kind
want
of
like all
crust?
of it. What's that?
What kind of crust?
Thin. I'm thin.
Ah, yeah, we'll talk later. I like New York crust. Second question. If you were not a political science professor, I kind of feel like you gave us this answer. If you were not anything that you've already done before, what
Hmm.
would you be?
Ooh, I have always, so my husband is a home brewer, like he brews beer, and I love reading. And so we've always wanted to open a little like bookstore with a bar attached to it. So you could like go to the bar, like get a beer and then go browse for the books and like sit and like sip your beer and like read the books and buy books. And so we even have a name for it. It could be called like Shakespeare, like Shakespeare,
What?
right?
That is so clever.
Or it could be Books and Brew, you know? So coming to a
I
neighborhood
don't
near
know if
you.
you can see, but a few of my team members are on screen and they're giving you hearts and smiles and thumbs up. And I'm pretty sure others are feeling the same way. So we need you to start it in some place, maybe in Maryland or someplace. We'll come visit you. And then you come out to Singapore and you open up the same thing.
I mean, it's like that's my live stream. I'm just saying it out here.
That's amazing. Okay, we're taking note and we will support you. The final
Okay.
question before we end our LinkedIn live session is what makes you proud to be Asian American?
What makes me proud to be Asian? I mean, well, so
Asian
I'm Korean,
American.
so it's like
Yeah, it's like
K-drama.
the Sandra Oh. Do you remember that Sandra Oh quote that was circulating and I have a t-shirt with it? I'm just proud to
No,
be
but
Asian.
oh yeah, I
Yeah,
know.
like that. So what makes you proud to be Asian American?
Um, well, I mean everything. It's like the culture, the food. It's just like, I feel like right now, there's also yeah. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, honestly, is the food. I will say that. There's just like I grew up in Houston, Texas, and there's like a really diverse Asian community in Houston. Like we have one of the largest Vietnamese communities outside of Vietnam, like in Houston and stuff like that. And so there's like this great, just kind of like Asian fusion blend of food kind of opportunities that are there. And that's like the first, thing that I think of. But in reality, it's just like everything, I just love everything about it. So
So like Sandra Oh, we are just proud to be Asian.
I want one of the t-shirts now.
Yeah, I'll find it
We'll
for you.
sell the t-shirts at my bookstore.
Okay, all right. And then we'll invite her to come and join us next time.
Exactly. I'm sure she'll
Okay.
come. Yeah.
So thank you everyone for joining us on LinkedIn Live. We're now going to move to the private conversation on Zoom. Give me the team, give me the signal when we are off of LinkedIn Live. Thank you.